When interacting with people who are different from us in various ways, there's two things that we could do. The first thing is that we could overlook a particular difference and use it as a way to treat everyone equally, treat that person the same way we would treat everyone else. On the other hand, there's some differences that we don't want to overlook that might actually be reasons why we should treat a person differently. Maybe they require a different treatment than other people would. So this is a really tricky situation because we kind of inherit both messages. On one hand, we're told to overlook difference, that difference is only skin deep. On the other hand, we're told to appreciate and affirm difference and even celebrate difference. So which of these do we do? As an example, I was a special educator in public schools, and I remember the push and pull here. On one hand, you don't want to stigmatize students, even if they have differences or learning differences that might require different treatment at some point. We want to treat everyone the same. We want to treat everyone similarly. And certainly a lot of students didn't want extra help because it would single them out. On the other hand, the fact that there are differences there meant that in some cases they might require different treatment. Students in wheelchairs may require ramps or wider spaces to navigate or doors that open or people to help them. Students who have learning disabilities might require different assignments or additional time on things that their peers might not get. On the other hand, they also really, really want to be treated the same. So this is what we're going to talk about on this video. We're going to talk about these two competing messages. On the one hand, difference is something to get beyond and look past. On the other hand, difference is something to embrace, affirm, or even celebrate. And I'm going to say that there's historical reasons why we've inherited both of these messages, even though the messages kind of conflict. This is what legal scholar Martha Minow calls dilemmas of difference. And here's the way she puts it. She asks, when does treating people differently emphasize their difference and stigmatize or hinder them on that basis? And when does treating people the same become insensitive to their differences and likely to stigmatize or hinder them on that basis? These are dilemmas, situations where more than one way to proceed could make plausible sense. As Minow puts it, treating everyone equally has a certain ring to it, a certain justice, but it could also come at the expense of either not offering appropriate accommodations to people or demanding that different others sacrifice important parts of their identities to fit in. I'm not here to resolve this dilemma. We all have to work out solutions for ourselves. But what I can offer you is reasons to think that we have these dilemmas for valid historical reasons. In the United States, at least, we've inherited a history of civil rights movements, and the messages that we've inherited have kind of been mixed or conflicting. On one hand, Black, GLBTQ, and women's rights movements have proceeded by demanding the right to assimilate or integrate. And on the other hand, these movements often became less about demands at integration and more about demands for recognition, where the idea was less about the right to integrate into normal society and more about the right to challenge and loosen up what could be counted as normal in the first place. So let's start with the Black civil rights movement. I think that's a good place. For most of its history, the movement involved pushing for Black people to have the same rights as did white people. The right not to be slaves and to own the fruits of their labor, to vote, to be free of brutal racial violence, to be subject to the same laws, all of that. It was an excruciatingly tall order and involved a message that the differences between Black and white were solely surface level. Here's how Dr. Martin Luther King put it.
I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Now, we're rightly taught to laud the words of Dr. King and groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that he helped to found. But as effective as that idea was, it came at a large cost. Simply put, white people were shamefully slow to accept the message if they ever truly did. Many a nonviolent march animated by this integrationist idea was met with loud and violent resistance among white people who refused to offer to meet black people on an equal footing. Even attempts to integrate the schools in 1955's Brown versus Board of Education were often met with statewide resistance and even legally endorsed violence. The assimilationist approach did lead to some robust legislation like the 1966 Civil Rights Act, but those things moved slow and there was actually a cost to this approach. Behind that generation of activists and their integrationist strategies, many young black people became frustrated. Repeatedly asking to be treated as equals only to be denied became infuriating. It grew to be sort of like groveling, and a kind of groveling you increasingly resent because you know it's going to be met with increased skepticism. Also, for a minority group, integration can be self-effacing. It often means that one will be treated as fully human only to the extent that you adopt the dominant social norms. One can even grow to see the ways in which one differs from the norm as obstacles to their humanity. This became known as the politics of respectability, and it's understandable why it would lose its allure. So into this, Stokely Carmichael, one of those young activists who helped develop and channel the idea of Black Power, gave voice to this frustration. Here's how he put it. Our concern for Black Power addresses itself directly to this problem, the necessity to reclaim our history and identity from the cultural terrorism and depredation of self-justifying white guilt. To do this, we shall have to struggle for the right to create our own terms to define ourselves and our relationships to the society, and to have these terms recognized. This is the first necessity of a free people and the first right that any oppressor must suspend. One motivating idea of the Black Power movement was to modify the integrationist message. Proving to white people that our moral worth comes from being roughly the same as them means that black people grow to measure their worth by how well they conform to white ideals. Instead, said this movement, we will teach black people to love themselves on their own terms. Those differences we were previously implicitly told to de-emphasize and were told by white people made us ugly and inferior, we will now call a source of pride. You can actually see it if you compare two sets of pictures. On one hand, you have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That's the group that King helped develop. And you'll notice that they have shirts and ties, and they're doing their best to kind of look respectable in the way that you would expect white people to dress. On the other hand, you have a picture of any Black Panther gathering, and you're going to see a little bit more of a challenge to the establishment. You have neat outfits, you have turtlenecks, leather jackets, you have berets. It's much more militant. You have proud afros, whereas the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had their hair neatly cropped. So you can definitely see the difference here. The first group, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, is definitely trying to fit in with existing generally white norms. And the Black Panthers are doing their best to, in some ways, challenge those norms and say, we're going to embrace our Blackness, our Africanness, and you will respect us on our terms. These are both parts of the American civil rights movements, and both achieve certain goals. The integrationist message won black people certain legal rights, and the Black Power movement won black people a certain sort of self-respect. The difficulty is that as contradictory as their messages are about how, whether, and when to integrate, about the value of sameness and difference to self-worth, U.S. culture has also inherited both of these messages and hasn't really resolved it in favor of one or the other. These two themes can also be seen in the GLB movement, and we'll leave out the T for transgender because its visibility came later. The pattern's actually really similar. Formal efforts for GLB rights started largely with the foundation of the Mattachine Society in 1950. Later, a lesbian sister group would form called the Daughters of Bilitis. Like the early days of the Black civil rights movement, the Mattachine Society was primarily concerned with defending the right of gay people to equal protection of the law. Gays were not allowed to serve in positions in federal government, were often subject to sodomy laws that were blatantly discriminatory against them, and were also banned from things like the legal protection of ability to rent spaces, rent houses or buildings, things like that. Really what they wanted was to be treated the same. And also like King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Mattachine Society's message was an assimilationist one, predicated on what some now call the politics of respectability. The idea was to show that gay people were in essence just like everyone else, and that the difference in sexual preference or orientation was really trivial in most areas. And this approach did meet with some successes. It did lead to a gradual striking down of sodomy laws and a gradual treatment of gay people as equal protection laws in things like real estate markets. But it did gradually lead some members, again, like with the Black civil rights movement, usually the younger ones, to dissatisfaction with the assimilationist message. While the Mattachine Society would go on strong through the 1960s, members disaffected with the assimilationist message splintered off to form new groups, and this came to a noticeable head when, in 1969, police raided the Stonewall Inn, a gay bar in New York. The raids were typical of the time, unfortunately, and this one just frustrated patrons and allies, and they found themselves fighting back in self-defense. So historian Lillian Faderman depicts the rift this caused between the older, more assimilationist and the younger, more assertive members. An unidentified representative of Mattachine Society New York was quick to chalk a message on Stonewall's boarded-up windows that betrayed the immediate response of many respectable gays. We homosexuals plead with our people to help maintain peaceful and quiet conduct on the streets of our village. But a new generation had just ushered in a new gay era, and the Mattachine plea for peaceful and quiet conduct seemed to them nothing short of laughable. For village gays, the riots had been equivalent to Rosa Parks taking a forbidden seat on the front of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama. The rest of the world might not know it yet, but they knew that there was no going back to the way things had been. This led to more assertive groups being formed, most famously the Gay Liberation Front. For the GLF, as for the Panthers, assimilation was unacceptable if it meant, as they suspected it did, that gays and lesbians and other gender nonconforming people had to mask any difference that challenged straight norms, what we might today call heteronormativity. Faderman continues, by the end of July 1969, Gay Liberation Front members formulated a statement of purpose whose tone mirrored the uncompromising militancy of groups such as the Black Panthers, with whom many of the GLFers, especially the men, had a spiritual romance. GLF defined itself as a, quote, revolutionary group of men and women that had formed with the realization that, quote, sexual liberation for all people cannot come about unless existing social institutions are abolished. So there's the same rough shape to these movements. What once starts as an assimilationist plea for the dominant group to ignore perceived difference, skin color, sexual orientation, becomes an assertion of the differences needed to be affirmed rather than ignored, to pose a challenge to dominant norms rather than be absorbed into existing ones. The same tension, by the way, can be seen in the women's civil rights movements. There, the goal has often been equal treatment of women to men under the law, to be able to have the same jobs as men, or to be able to have the same options men do. Yet, feminists have often realized that this equal treatment comes at the cost, the demand that women act more like men in these spaces. And that led to demands that the norms in those areas change to recognize the ways in which women differ from men. Both of these strands, both the demand for inclusion to be treated equally and the demand to be treated differently by affirming difference, are part of our cultural inheritance. On the one hand, we aspire to color-blindness, the idea that we shouldn't see or take seriously certain differences. We should treat people equally with demands that we treat them the same and overlook differences. On the other hand, there's a sensitivity that overlooking difference could mean denying people the right to a particular identity, and that asking us to be treated the same often means asking the minority to cede to the majority's ways. As mixed as these messages are, they're both part of this cultural inheritance and they both have something to be said for them. Maybe they're appropriate in different domains. Equality should be the norm in certain areas of life, and recognition and affirmation of difference should be the norm in others. These strands have both come to us as, I think, equally valuable pieces of civil rights struggles that have taken place in the United States. And as contradictory as they seem, they're also complementary in certain ways, each responding to an oversight in the other. So, should we ignore difference or should we celebrate difference? Culturally, the answer is, I think, up for grabs. And in part, we have our mixed history to thank for that.